So Gauri, you are a storyteller and anthropologist.
Mm-hmm.
And we were just saying, just before we started recording, that you and I have known each other for many years now.
Yeah, long
Um,
time.
a long time. And it's just really, I'm so grateful for you to have this conversation with me about the Secret Garden and about the empire and all of the themes of that come up in the book. So at
Thank
the
you so
top,
much, Danya. It's a pleasure to be here to reconnect with you, and it's just I'm so looking forward to it. It was such a pleasant surprise when you kind of your email pinged into my box. So
oh, that's lovely. And what was really interesting for me was that you hadn't read the book. And so now you have,
mhm.
and I'd be really interested to hear your sort of immediate response to it before we dig deeper.
I loved it. I was so surprised at how much I loved it. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the elements that completely like they're not old at all. They're such contemporary issues in the book. Um, and yeah, I thought I was reading about a girl from not very long ago when I read this book. So it's difficult for me to believe that this is a book that's been around for a long, long time. Um, but it's one of those books that it's just explores so many things, and in some ways it's very English. Um, a very different England than when I remember in my childhood reading books about England, which were mainly kind of like Enid Blyton. And to me, those had more of like this feel of old England than this book does. Uh, Although it talks a lot about the empire, and it's that's part of this book, but yeah, the sort of Mary Poppins England that I had an image of is not this at all. So it was, uh, I loved
Interesting.
it. I've read it in like 48 hours straight. I couldn't put it down.
That's really interesting because actually, like Mary, you were born and raised in India and then came over to the United Kingdom to England and now to Scotland. Um, so I'm fascinated by that because you made that shift, which I see in The Secret Garden as a massive shift for Mary,
Yeah.
to come from, um, I suppose, a very hot, um, rich in quality experience to this very bleak Yorkshire winter. And I'd be really fascinating. I'd be
Oh,
fascinated to know, what your experience was of making that change. But also, I think you do live and travel between the two countries, so I'd be really interested in that and your take of Mary as a result of your own experience.
okay. So yes, I think we both made that journey across the seven seas, as they say in India. Um, I came to England as an adult, unlike Mary, who comes as a child. But I think there's one other really crucial difference. I came to England in that it was a new land, and I was leaving my community. I think the sense I get from this book is for Mary, although she's born in India, she's in some ways returning to an ancestral home.
Mm.
And I think there is, yeah, the quality of the experience, my experience would be very different because I would be an Asian migrant, whereas Mary would be uh, a child coming home
Yes.
in some way. I think what is in terms of what I loved about the book, and it also surprised me completely, and I've written it down here, is that it's such an unsparing look at what colonialism and the empire does, not just to the colonized, so to the Indians who were serving the British, not just to them, but also to what we might call the innocence of the colonizer. So Mary is an innocent. She's not kind of one of those who's who's made a choice to, go out to India, like unlike her
Yeah.
father, I suppose, and serve the empire's cause in the colony. Mary's just born there. She's that innocent, but colonialism affects her. It
Mm,
affects her bodily, it affects her psychologically, it affects who she becomes as a child and how she learns to talk to everybody, which then, when she comes back to England, to her own people in some way, that that is kind of a reckoning.
mm,
Not in that big biblical sense, but for a child's world, that is a reckoning, because people can speak up to her, look her in the eye, and say what they have to say, um, and which in India, that wouldn't be possible because of the hierarchy of just um, being the servants of the empire,
mm,
being colonized. You would never, kind of dare to equalize that relationship, even with a child. So that was something I found just as an underlying kind of thread that runs through the book, and how finding our way home is just so vital. It is such a vital force, however we find ourselves coming home. Um, which I've not read many books, especially children's books from that period, kind of really unsparingly looking at that. She is the spoiled, rotten kid. And I think somewhere early on in the book, it also says very clearly how she would slap her ayahs, how she would slap her
mm,
servants. They did not like her, uh, to the point that they ignored her when her parents died
yeah.
and she was
Yeah.
absolutely abandoned. So they
Yeah.
absolutely did not like her, but they dare not say anything to her.
Mm,
And what that does to a child, it kind of double displaces them in some way, that there is nobody to give them a childhood.
mm. Absolutely. And it's in finding the childhood and finding those people who could just match her, as you say, who would not stand her precociousness or her, flaming temper or whatever it is, allowed her then to become a child. So for me, I was very interested in this idea of the contrast, and it's sort of underlying in Frances Hodgson Burnett's writing, that in India isn't a good place and Yorkshire is a good place, whereas actually the reality is it isn't to do with where she is but who she's with, and
Yeah.
that her parents completely abandon her,
Mm.
and when she comes to Yorkshire she starts to befriend people. Now, it could have been the reverse. It could have been that she had a terrible time in Yorkshire. So, but I'm fascinated by that underlying, which, feeds that story
Yeah.
uh, of England being better.
It's
Um,
so interesting because in a sense she's abandoned by her parents in India as well. The parents are basically
yes,
they ignore her, they carry on with their lives.
exactly.
But it is then she could have befriended the staff. She could have befriended what were called the servant community there, her nanny, her
Yes.
ara, or her governesses, etc. But what comes there then is the empire. It's the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. And that determines, that tells her how a child should behave so that
Mm,
she also teaches later on her cousin these stock phrases of how you behave as a little prince or a little princess. And you just stand there and wait to be dressed, and
mm,
put your hand out for the glove to be put on. And so this is the kind of, this is not the response of an ignored child. This is where it is the relationship, it's the colonial relationship that is telling a child what is appropriate behavior, which is very damaging.
mm,
And it kind of completely, she grows up as an old woman in that place. She loses her childhood. So that's what colonialism does in
mm,
any form. To me, it was really instructive. And what was interesting was I didn't so much read it as India as a bad place and Britain as a good place, but I read it um, as how empire withered a child,
mm. Interesting.
and what being in a place where there was not that ruler ruled hierarchy, because she's effectively in this house where even her uncle who takes her in is not present.
Yeah.
And so she has to deal with people in their own tongue. There is no upstairs downstairs, because even though it's a mansion house she's living in, there are no adults to mind the house or govern the relationship. So it's the staff that is in effect giving life to that old house. They're the ones who are keeping the life force of that house going. And in order to then live in that house, she has to become part of that life force. She
Mm,
has to learn the Yorkshire slang. She has to learn how to dress herself and ask for help, ask for things, rather than them being given to her.
mm.
And I think that kind of allows her to become human.
Yeah. And that is the journey, isn't it? It is. And as a storyteller, that the monomyth is a very powerful story of the journey that we take
Mhm.
to overcome our demons and to become more human. And
And I
yeah.
love the aspect of um, the world around her, the garden, the vegetation, the weather, the moors. Uh, to me, coming as an Indian migrant here, um, it it's I call it an upside down world. So every time I come to Britain, it's it's exactly the opposite of, my body has to reorient itself completely, uh, because everything is dissimilar. Everything, the moisture in the air to start with, um, how we look at water, the light is
Mm,
different, everything is different. But I grew up with the festivals and the values of my community in India. So for me, the landscape is very linked in India to my celebrations, to my joys, to my griefs, to my sadnesses, to my childhood. I smell India. When I came to Britain, it was I used to get migraines in the beginning because I felt like I couldn't smell anything, I couldn't um, hear anything. All
Interesting.
my senses were cut off. So it's very interesting how for Mary, it feels like even though, she was in the garden trying to pluck flowers and plant them in
Yes.
soil,
Yeah.
that's the metaphor. That's how she was. She was not off the soil. She was plucked. And then she was really trying to plant herself in there with the soil giving her no hospitality at all.
Mm,
She had to mediate the servant class. She had to mediate. She didn't even speak their language that well. She knew a song that her ayah
yeah.
kind of used to sing to her,
Yeah.
but she had no access to the the senses that
Mm,
living in India brings. And the British, the empire, colonial officers, they lived in bungalows. They built houses that were modeled on the British houses. So they never had a feel of what
mm,
it is. The children, they lived in Little England, as we call
mm,
it in
mm,
India. So for her, I think to come back here, she came from almost a sensory vacuum into a place where probably she had hope because she was forced to go out and seek things out,
yeah.
and she
And
found
battle with the wind.
and battle with the wind, but she
Yes.
also found others who looked at her as their equal. So they said, come along with us on the journey. So she
Mm,
finds the boy who is friends with the robins, who knows how to talk the language of the robins, or has friends who are lambs and crows.
yes. Yeah.
So she has people who will show her how to because, and that's what childhood is about, isn't it?
Mm,
It's partly it's a voyage of discovery, but partly it's also uh, this caring that says this is how you do it, this
mm.
is how you learn to fly. Whereas in India it was like, let me keep your nest tidy and clean, and you sit here and eat, and everything will be fine.
And it's interesting that, what you were saying earlier was that she could have befriended her ayah or the servants, but that she didn't, because actually that's not what the empire
Yeah.
told her to do. But I was fascinated by our conversation about ayahs in general.
Hmm.
And when we were speaking last week, and the ayah in the story isn't a driver in any way, but I remember as a child somehow this unnamed person, she had an effect on me, and I don't really know why, but it was a bit like the ivory elephants that she discovers in one of the 100 rooms.
Mm.
It's a tiny, tiny little part of the whole book, but it had a very strong impact on me. So when I went back to it and reread it, I was quite surprised how little the ayah is mentioned. But
Mm.
but the history of ayahs, and your research of ayahs is really fascinating. Would you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, yeah, I was a bit surprised when I read, but I think in the book, her relationship with her ayah is probably the way most relationships with ayahs went.
Mm,
I think a lot of my research looked at the women who became ayahs.
yeah. Yes.
So definitely there was an oppression there from their masters,
For sure.
uh, abuse, not just from children in the way it's outlined here, but sometimes from the colonial officer. Um, sexual abuse or, mental, physical abuse. Those incidents would have been there. Um, Many of the ayahs that I find fascinating in my research are women who chose to become ayahs.
Mm,
And what I find is many are, um, so an ayah is a nanny, a wet nurse, looking after the children. That's her job. Uh, they were they came from the natives, so the Indians. You never had British nannies going to look after British children there. Um, Many times these were single women who'd been widowed really early in life. So an ayah is not a figure who is a very old woman who is, at the end of her life, grandmotherly figure taking care of this child. She's probably a young widow who who is living with her in-laws or at the mercy of her in-laws in that period in India, where child remarriage, or rather widow remarriage, was not condoned. It was certainly not a normal part of life.
mm,
Uh, and the lot of widows, there are many films around this, the lot of child widows especially, was quite bleak because
mm,
they were reliant on their husband's family. Their family wouldn't take them back
mm,
based on Indian traditions of a woman post marriage. Um, and and sometimes there would be incidents of abuse by their husband's family, so they literally had nowhere to turn to.
mm.
So taking and they would be kind of regarded as impure, inauspicious, because they would be held responsible for their husband's death. um, yeah, customs at that time. And so for many, um, I would imagine that being in the employ of a British household would be a mixed bag, in a sense. It probably gave them independence, distance if it was an abusive household. It gave them a little bit of company because they were in the company of a child, which they probably could never have
Mm,
legitimately. Um, and maybe it gave them a modicum of financial independence as well.
mm,
It changed the dynamic with, their own family back in the villages or in the cities where they came from. Some of the ayahs got really close to the children, to the families, and you do have records in Britain of ayahs coming over with the family uh, when maybe the term of contract for the colonial officer ended, or the mother and the child sought to come back. They brought their ayah back. So in sort of around 1910, 1920, you find photographs of ayahs on the streets of London, taking a pram in their saris or holding a child who is white. It's not their own child. You also have agencies coming up in London, um, which are either for bringing ayahs to London to be employed in British families here, or ayahs who finish their tenure and are looking for other jobs in Britain and not wanting to go back, or those wanting to go back. So there must have been enough of them for agencies to exist.
yeah.
Um, and so that relationship is quite fascinating, what it does for um, what um, being in the employ of the ruler gives to a woman
Mm,
in a cult, especially in a cultural context where she might not have great life chances or life opportunities.
Mm.
It's a way out. Um, how once they find that employ, how that pans out is more often, I think it was a tragedy.
Mm.
They were between a rock and a hard place.
Mm.
But for that moment, there was hope, maybe.
Mm.
And my own research I'm doing is about, I'm working on a storytelling piece, um, which is based on a book written by a British girl who was brought up. Her mother had died. Her father was posted in India, and so she was in India with her father. And she had an ayah who was a native. And the ayah told her stories, and the girl remembered these stories. When she grew up and came back to England, she wrote these stories down as she understood them. So they're very, very Victorian. Um, and she published them. But what's fascinating is she published a long biography of her ayah, which is unusual. There were many, many cases where these you do find, like, tales of the Hindu, or these, yeah, hardbound books of folk tales collected by British officers or kids. But there's no mention of where they came from, who the sources
Mm.
are. And to me, this one particular one is, what must that bond have been between the ayah and her ward? How would it have grown? And what must the parting have been like, because the ayah didn't come back? How
Yeah.
does that work? It's a fascinating domain of, yeah, women, just the women's world.
Yes. Yes. And it's the macrocosm of that, the microcosm of that whole um, empire, and what was going on. I was really fascinated by that, by the very personal and the very human, but also the very feminine,
Mm, mm,
or the female,
mm.
compared to the sort of very masculine
Yeah.
construct. But I was also, when we first started looking at this book and saying yes, we'd like to produce it, and it was going to be on stage, um, we had a lot of conversations and wrestled a lot with the whole opening of the story, and the parts of it which are linked to empire, which is why I wanted to have this conversation, because there's I had a sort of a desire to just go, no, 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 I'm not going anywhere near that, and I don't want to touch that, and it's just too offensive really to even engage with it, which is why I think when I've seen stage productions of The Secret Garden before, you just get her coming across and arriving in England. But as a storyteller, I'd be really interested to know how you might tell the story. Um, would you engage with that very beginning? Because I imagine that it's got quite a lot of richness about it,
Mm,
because it's out of that, as you were saying earlier, that Mary grows. That
mhm,
that's the contortion,
mm.
and the twist of her that needs to be healed in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you and I both know that storytellers are in some way truth tellers. And I think um, leaving out that first part would be essentially um, suppressing the ugly side
Yeah,
of empire.
yeah.
So it is not truth telling. And what I find Frances Hodgson Burnett has done is told us the truth. And that's what makes that first part to me just so relevant and so important to be told in Britain today, because as you know, there are ongoing debates about, the benefits of empire to the colonies. And these are the parts that exist. These are the parts that the British wrote about what they observed or what it did to their own children,
Mm,
which are the effects we're seeing now
mm,
of, what happens when you suppress the negative aspects of your history out of guilt, out of politeness, out
yeah.
of, you know, just not wanting to
Embarrassment.
face
Yep.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But as a storyteller, I would say, guys, this is what we did. This
Mm,
is what we did to ourselves. And that's why empire is not a good idea. Because like when I was teaching at Warwick, I would be teaching this course on post-colonial states. And I found young men and women, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, reading this stuff about, what the empire was. And we look at kind of everyday histories. So we're looking at what it did at an everyday level. And I was so surprised the first time I taught that course that people in my class were horrified. And I was like, did you not learn about
yeah.
this?
Yeah.
And I said, this is the first time we're reading it. And then what was horrifying for me, and ironical, the irony is not lost, coming from the colony, was I would be spending a lot of time in those classes, um, almost kind of giving therapy to the kids, saying, it's fine. We are dealing with our mess that you left behind. Please, you deal with your mess. You don't have to feel
Mm,
sorry for us. We've dealt with it. We're still dealing with it, but we are aware that we're dealing with it.
yeah.
You know, don't carry this guilt because it's something that your ancestors did, not you. And you don't have to carry that guilt.
But
And
like you're saying, guilt can suppress it, which means that it can come again. Whereas
absolutely.
actually, if we face it,
Yeah.
you know, and speak about it and teach about it, maybe we've got a chance of it not repeating.
And what's wonderful for me in this book, like what I really love is, and I'll be recommending this book to people, um, to the people in Britain, is you don't have to look at like huge archival works to see how many people were killed.
Mm,
Your own people wrote about it,
mm,
about what it does at everyday levels to relationships
mm,
within your own communities, not only just to, us, the other, the non-British.
yeah.
Uh, that is what is the mechanics of governments and empires. But for the people who were serving the colonial officers, look what it did to their families and their lives.
Mm, mm,
And that needs to kind of be grappled with.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's such a relevant book. It's such a relevant book. Um, yeah. So
Gauri, just thank you so much. I want to carry on and carry on. Maybe we will after we finish recording, but really I'm so grateful for you to speak to me, and I just love connecting with you every time we do. So thank you.
thank you. I and thank you for this gift of the book. It's been so, I'll be so grateful to you. Thank you so much, Danyah.